Welcome to Think Orphan, the podcast for orphan excellence. Real talk with real people navigating the global orphan crisis.
Welcome back to the Think Orphan podcast. I hope that this Tuesday is treating you well. You know, when this releases, a number of us are going to be in Oklahoma City for the Christian Alliance for Orphans Summit. So if you're listening to this as you head to CAFO, hopefully you find me, hopefully you find Phil, hopefully you connect with some of the colleagues and people that you guys have heard here on Think Orphan. I'm going to use the word looking forward to getting into this conversation, not because of the details of it, but because of the people that we get to learn from. For those that don't know, my name is Brandon Stiver, and I'm flying solo today in terms of hosting. My esteemed colleague and friend, Phil Dark, is traveling at the moment. So I'm left to do hosting duties on my own, but I know that Phil will hopefully listen. And I really hope he listens. This is going to be one of the most academic sounding podcasts, because not only do we have one person with a PhD, but the other two both have British accents. So I think we are going to do really well. That'll probably be my first and last joke due to the content of this particular podcast. But I am joined today by three colleagues, Greg Burch from Multnomah University, Dan Hope from SFAC, and Kelly Strong from the Kenyan Children's Project. And what we're going to be discussing today is a sensitive topic. Obviously, on Think Orphan, you guys have heard us talk a lot about different ways to intervene for orphan and vulnerable children. We talk a lot about intercultural pieces, including just in recent episodes. And we're going to kind of bring a few of those elements together on this podcast today, but really kind of focus on issues of abuse, issues of exploitation, and hopefully how we can mitigate those with effective child protection and safeguarding standpoint. So as we get into this conversation, you know, anytime we're talking about, you know, what do you think about orphans? What do you think about vulnerable kids? What do you think about, you know, this whole space that we're operating in? There's really a clear imperative for child protection and safeguarding. And I know a lot of organizations. I mean, I even remember when I first kind of delved into this space myself, I was working at a children's home in East Africa. It was a faith-based orphanage, and there were 26 kids there, and there was no child protection policy of any sort. And unfortunately, that's not an uncommon story. And what we're going to get into today is that when we don't actually have protection policies and practices that are in place, things can really go off the rails. And we are going to mention a few specific cases. Even I've provided just some overview material to our guests today, and you will find those in the show notes at thinkorphan.com. And you'll get some of the links as well if you guys are listening in Apple or Spotify or wherever you might be listening from, but definitely check thinkorphan.com. I'm going to come around and just allow each of our guests to introduce themselves and just introduce where they're coming from and really kind of what brought them into this child protection space and even their connection to promoting child protection and safeguarding. So I got two people that are back on the show, so we'll start with them. Dan, why don't you go first? Why don't you just briefly introduce yourself and how you kind of came into the child protection space?
Okay, well, thank you, Brandon. So my name is Dan Hope. I'm the CEO of SFAC, which is a small international charity based in the UK, but we operate globally, supporting organisations are involved in the care and protection of children. And I, a qualified social worker of around 20 years, first started in children's homes, working in children's homes in the UK and in Kenya, then fell into social work, did a degree in that, a master's degree in that, and worked in child protection and in the family courts representing children, and then got involved in international work. And really my heart is in making sure that children are safe, that the way that we look after them enables children to thrive but from a safe place. That really you can't really thrive unless you are in that safe place, and not only being safe but also feeling safe. So our work is very much about supporting organizations to achieve that in their work, and we kind of provide that through training and mentoring and advice, and that's SFAC, and that's me.
And I'll just side note, SFAC have served as technical advisors for 1 Million Home, and you guys have heard Mick on here as well. We had Caitlin at 1.2, and they're just really the best of the best. So really appreciate, Dan, you jumping in with us. Dr. Greg Burch, why don't you just briefly introduce yourself and how you came into kind of this child protection conversation?
Hey, Brandon. Thanks so much for having me back on Think Orphan. So I live in Portland, Oregon, USA. I teach at a university here, a small Christian liberal arts university called Multnomah University. I think, Brandon, you know something about our program here.
Yes, we don't have like an alma mater song or anything that I know off the top of my head, but yes, salute to the forest green of Multnomah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brandon. I'll take that shout out. I direct the program, master's program called Global Development and Justice. Just in the nomenclature itself, you can see that we work with a variety of students that come into the program wanting to work in international development work, local community development work, as well as justice initiatives around the world. A number of our students go out and work with child care organizations and institutions, and so we're kind of part of that conversation on a regular basis. I teach courses here on children at risk, on child protection, and looking at the role of child participation as well, right? So that's a critical piece to helping children thrive. Formerly, I worked in Caracas, Venezuela. I worked there for 7 years with homeless youth, street living children, both as a street educator, volunteer, as well as national director of an organization there that was based in Caracas. We worked with primarily children living on the streets, but we also had some homes set up where parents would care for kids in their homes, and also worked within a detention care facilities. The government had detention care homes set up, and we would volunteer and serve kids in those detention care services as well. And I could talk much more about that. But after that, began working in academia. So moved to Costa Rica, San Jose, Costa Rica, and worked there for a number of years. Had the opportunity to work alongside colleagues in Costa Rica, folks with Viva Latin America, as well as other organizations, setting up a child at risk training program in Costa Rica, which still exists to this day. So that's been a real joy of mine. And these days, I spend a lot of time in the classroom teaching our students here a variety of different disciplines, anywhere from cultural anthropology to courses on children at risk to intercultural communication. Pretty spread quite thin in a lot of areas of the classes I teach, but still try to focus on child advocacy work here at Multnomah as much as I can with the very little time I have. But thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, well, really appreciate you jumping into this conversation, Greg. I've seen you support students at Multnomah thinking through child protection issues. So really glad that you can join this conversation. And last but certainly not least, first in most regards when it comes to me, Kelly Strong, would you introduce yourself and kind of how you come into this conversation?
Yes, hi Brandon. So thank you. I'm Kelly Strong. I am the CEO of the Kenyan Children's Project. And Executive Director at Children's Transformation Project Kenya, which is based in Western Kenya. So I got into this space really from travelling in my youth between the ages of 16 and 18, doing various different volunteer roles in Kosovo and in East Africa. So during some of these trips, I began to experience and be exposed really firsthand to the state of the world's children. So my heart for children globally became I was really struck by the need. So I began to see the picture of what children were facing, the risks, the tragedies every single day across the world. So as my heart for these things continued to grow, I actually went in to study nursing in the UK and became a registered nurse. So although I still had this big desire to sort of do something about what I had seen, I continued to train as a nurse and became a registered nurse. And it was during my time nursing on the wards that I became quite passionate about best practice. I realized it was a moving target. And as a practitioner, in whatever field you're in, you're constantly having to commit time to continuous learning and skill development. So I was surrounded by, as a young nurse, by many, hundreds of senior professionals that were still undergoing regular training, working within, different improvement assessment frameworks, trying to provide, professionals with ways that they can continually provide good and consistent, comparable quality care to their patients. And I started to imagine a world where fundamental safeguarding of children and reform of social care existed and was put into place for children across the world. So that's kind of how things started to sort of progress with my sort of passion. I ended up going back over to East Africa with my husband to visit a variety of different projects. And I had lined up a nurse placement in a clinic in Uganda. But I quickly saw more devastating impact of the lack of child protection in that location. And it was at that point we moved over to Kenya and we saw the same again. So we ended up working within a project called Kenyan Children's Project, which I'm still a part of and I'm now the CEO of. And we have essentially worked with the organisation to bring better care for children in that context, working with the locals and developing new policies and procedures to better the sort of services there for children. So they're more refined. The services are, more short, medium and long-term focused instead of just short-term focused. And we're continuing to do that work still today. Yeah, so that's a bit about me.
Oh, that's good. Thank you so much, Kelly. And as I look over the three faces on this screen, I mentioned SFAC, or Technical Advisors for 1 Million Home. Dan is a close colleague, has probably taught me far more than he realizes. Greg, same regard. I'm a Multnomah grad. I'm also teach there from time to time, co-teach with Greg. So, and KCP, I am on the board of trustees. So there's all my I don't think these are bad incentives by any stretch, but just to say, these are the people that I really believe in. So thank you, each of you, for being on Think Orphan with us. We're gonna kind of jump into the topic at hand, and I just kind of want to share with our listeners. We are going to be getting into some sensitive material that is centered around abuse, child abuse in general, but even specifically looking at, some Westerners that have entered into Global South communities and ministries that basically take advantage of and exploit issues, child protection issues towards their own gain. I just want to kind of mention that our intent in this is not to be salacious, but just to be honest. And we will only reference publicly released verified cases. Okay. And you guys can check the show notes. You guys will see stuff there from BBC, from Associated Press, and other credible news outlets as we kind of dive into some of these things that have happened over the years. There's also a research document that I've shared with our guests in advance. This was actually some original work that I did during my graduate degree at Multnomah for a professor. Her name is Krista Crawford. So you will find that as well in the show notes. Jumping in, I just kind of wanted to pull a quote really quick here in a moment, but essentially the framework that we're looking at is when a kid has become vulnerable for one reason or another, there needs to be an intervention and there needs to be child protective mechanisms that are put into place. And there has to be people that are willing to protect that child and uphold those policies. unfortunately, what we see is when a child has either been orphaned or has become vulnerable or at risk for other factors, they aren't just, at higher risk of, malnutrition or lack of medical needs, but even in terms of social, relational, physical, sexual abuse as well. And the reality is, especially for those that are working within the orphan care space, there are people that can get into these systems and exploit and take advantage of those gaps and take advantage of the heightened vulnerability of children. Now, if we were to look back over some of the past conversations that we have had here on Think Orphan, we've talked about the $2.5 billion of American Christian money that goes into orphanages throughout the world. That was based on the research done by Barna and Faith to Action and Changing the Way We Care. We look at, a similar piece in that study talks about millions of dollars being sent on short-term missions trips, right? So there is this entire infrastructure around cross-cultural interventions, so to speak. We can call it, cross-cultural engagement between Westerners and those that are living in places like East Africa, where I'm going to set a few of these examples. So this is kind of like, in a way, looking at the underbelly, but we also have to look at the whole piece. So, and I have these trusted colleagues here not only because of their professional acumen, but also because of their my own personal trust to have this conversation with them. So I'm just going to read really quick from the research document that, again, you guys can find at thinkorphan.com in the show notes for this episode. I wrote in the piece, this lack of family and organizational protection leaves the children available to be abused and exploited by outsiders that pose as concerned internationals that are willing to help and donate. I quote from two academics, Lineham and Fecchini, the volunteerism industry may therefore be attractive to traveling sex offenders who perceive easy and direct access to children living in orphanages through a seemingly legitimate channel. Documented cases of exploitation by volunteerists in East Africa include both faith-based and secular individuals that could be involved in a purported mission or socially conscious corporate activity. I'm going to get into a few of these cases now. So Matthew Lane Durham was sentenced to 40 years in prison after repeatedly raping and molesting children during a short-term mission trip at Upendo Children's Home in Nairobi, according to CNN. Simon Harris ran an educational charity and targeted street-dwelling Kenyan boys that he sexually abused, according to Morris. And again, you guys will see this in the show notes. British Airways pilot Simon Wood allegedly sexually abused children in institutional settings in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania during stopovers over a 10-year period, according to the BBC. Most recently, Gregory Dow was taken into custody after having established and run a Kenyan orphanage where he preyed on children over a 5-year period, according to the Associated Press. Durham and Dow both posed as Christian missionaries. Harris and Dow had both been convicted of child sexual abuse in their countries of origin, the UK and the US, respectively. While these documented cases exemplify the abuse taking place, child sexual exploitation by volunteerists, like sexual abuse in general, is likely underreported and perpetrators underconvicted, especially when one considers the lack of oversight by authorities and the amount of money that is in play. So that's just quoting from the document that you guys will find in your show notes. I'm going to come to Dan first. Dan, we're looking at these cases of both Americans and British individuals that are coming into these spaces. Can you just kind of speak to what are these child protection gaps that are being exploited? How do they emerge? What can be done? What are some of the things that you guys have seen as you guys have engaged really with organizations around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I'd also take it just back a little bit. One of the kind of key lessons that we've learned in the UK, when we've recently had a sexual abuse inquiry that's completed, has been the fact that abuse took place in children's homes, abuse takes place in foster care, and we have had to respond to that about, well, if we're moving children from places of vulnerability and abuse, to places where they are supposed to be protected, but actually are subject to abuse, then we need to do something about it. And really, why was it happening? Well, the same reason it was happening here in the past before these systems were put in place, are the same reasons it's happening elsewhere. There's a naivety, there is an ignorance, there is a power dynamic that is all going on. If you're a child and an adult is abusing you, you're in a very powerless situation. And that can only get worse if there aren't systems or knowledge about how you report or how you can highlight concerns, especially if it's institutional, where, you are being abused by people who are actually looking after you. So for me, it's always about a lack of understanding about what the risks are. And often when I hear in statements, it's often, well, we know them. We know that they'll be okay. Well, all of those people were known by people. Doesn't mean that they were safe. And there are always going to be risks, because if you want to abuse children, where are you going to go? And you're going to go
to where children are.
Exactly. And so the most vulnerable places are going to be where vulnerable children are, and vulnerable children can themselves be exploited because they're searching for people who are going to value them. They're vulnerable anyway. They may well be involved in sexualized behavior because that's part of their background of abuse. They are extremely vulnerable. And that's where, people are going to look for in terms of being able to exploit for own, ulterior motives. And so, a lot of it is an ignorance of what the risks are, or lack of understanding, or naivety around that. And it's a lack of systemic processes that ensure that we are protecting children. And it comes back to a point, I think, Greg, you said earlier, it's about children having a voice and children being involved as well, and making sure that we are talking to children and children have opportunities to say things.
Given the nature of this conversation today on Think Orphan, I didn't want to run a normal ad, but rather double down on what has always been the heart of the podcast, which is to equip and encourage those that are serving orphaned and vulnerable children. With that in mind, I want to point you towards 3 resources where you and your team can get better equipped to protect children. First, 1 Million Home did an e-course with SFAC on family reunification and safeguarding for our Journey Home platform. It is a question-based resource where you can get practical, applicable counsel. Second, you can go to SFAC's website at sfac.org.uk to check out their resources or get support. They have minimum safeguarding standards for orphanages and foster care that you can tap into. Third, Dr. Burch has a great course called Protecting the Vulnerable, Keeping Kids Safe Globally, which is available on multnomaplus.com. This can help you get policies and practices in place. All of these resources that I'm mentioning are either free or very cheap and are linked in the show notes. Go beyond the conversation and jump into resources that will help you protect children as we all pursue excellence in this work. Greg, what would you add to that?
Yeah, Dan, I really appreciate you bringing up this notion of naivete, lack of understanding. Just thinking about going back to my early years as a university student working with homeless youth in places like Bogota, Colombia, and Caracas, Venezuela, I would have never have imagined that there would have been people out there working with children, moving into these different cultural contexts that were motivated by a desire to abuse or to to in any way take advantage of young children. It just wasn't a part of my conscientious thinking, right? And how many people out there are just with good intentions wanting to support children and just aren't literally thinking about the risk that is so much a part of the work that many people do. So Brandon, too, I think we just need to talk about the predominant amount of people that are out there, young people serving on gap years. They're people with good intentions. Their motivations are right in many cases, or at least mixed, but they're wanting to help. And so we really need to keep in focus that there are a lot of good people out there doing the work. The need to train, the lack of understanding that Dan talks about is so critical, right? The training, education, Let's help them understand the risks that are involved. Let's help them understand the importance of creating a culture of awareness around them, right? There's much more we can say about that. But yeah, I just want to jump in. It's such an important point, Dan. Thank you.
Well, and I think it is interesting, even going off of what you said, Greg, in terms of the predominance of people. I think what we have to wrap our minds around is, even if these are, just a limited number of cases where, Westerners are abusing other people, it's actually based on the broader system where those that come in and don't have malevolent, intent with these children, that kind of creates that environment. Kelly, I would be interested to kind of hear from you, even, having worked, within this space, Uganda, Kenya, how do you guys go about this, and what do you think of kind of the broader environment?
Yeah, so I think we've seen, over the years, we've seen lots of different people coming over, short-term missions, short-term trips, volunteerism, and the combination of all those things also encourages people to behave quite differently and encouraged to behave quite differently to children that are, orphaned or within these facilities. So often we see, one-to-one attention being given to children where maybe, it would be very unlikely if somebody, from another country came over to the global north and they came into a school locally and played with children on a one-to-one basis. And so I see a lot of these things happening that actually are very inappropriate. There's maybe a lot of naivety around it. But the conversations of how appropriate some of these behaviours, happening would actually prevent some of these things we're discussing today. So I think that's something is a big topic. But, having sort of a bit of a light shine on that is really important, because often it's, like myself, I went out to countries when I was younger to offer support, help, and, very naive, very young, doing what I saw everybody else doing, skipping with the kids, playing with the kids. But, it's that harming instead of, helping aspect, not realizing that actually these children need to be protected somewhat more than, our own children in many ways, because of the adverse childhood experiences they have faced.
Right. It's certainly the case that one vulnerability puts them at higher risk for further adversity. I think that's kind of been seen from one study to another, and it goes back to what Dan was saying initially. If we kind of consider where these kids are coming from, and then what are they stepping into, then is kind of the next thing. Dan, what would you add?
Well, the other thing you have to add into this, in terms of the a global north, global south kind of language, if we use that to describe things, is the power dynamics that go on there. So if you are also the donor, or say you're the child sponsor, you create added levels in terms of power dynamics that can make that child even more vulnerable. And so, there are the individual characteristics of the child and the child's situation and the child's experiences, but there are also the structural elements which are about the systems in place. But you can make that even worse if the relationship is very much about, well, poverty is a very extreme thing. It's having a real big impact on us, and our donor is here, and we want to always keep this donor. And you create that relationship between donor and child, or donor and family. But another power dynamic, if that is an abusive relationship, especially if you come back to, well, you haven't got proper checks in place in relation to that. So there are whole systems that in place that can enable abuse to take place without us being able to be aware of it or act and protect.
Right. And that kind of speaks to some of those, gaps that I had asked about previously. That's helpful, Dan. I do kind of want to focus on this cross-cultural thing. I'm going to come to you, Greg. Greg, can you kind of speak to the cultural differences? You worked in Latin America for time. And you've seen this even as you're equipping, students at Multnomah. Can you just kind of speak to the cultural differences and the power disparities, when Westerners are engaging children and communities in the global South, and how are those differences really kind of enabling some of this abuse and exploitation?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of the terms that I want to use. We have seen historically, and it's been something that many of us have read about and thought a lot about, but this white savior, effect that has taken place where Westerners want to, for a variety of reasons, support and work in the majority world in the global South, right? And, I was a young person myself wanting to work in Latin America, coming out of a very affluent community in the United States. And so I'm part of this white savior, effect that we see around the world, I guess, in many ways. In those early years, when I was working with kids on the street, I felt pity. I felt, a sense of just a desire to really want to support young people that lived on the streets. I remember my father taking me to an orphanage when I was 12 years of age, and supporting children in an orphanage, and I was blown away, and I wanted to do something. It was this like, how is it that children are living like this, in this particular region of the world where I was visiting, and so it had a deep impact on me, and so white saviorism is certainly a part of it. But there's a lot of other isms, right? There's ethnocentrism. I teach a class on cultural anthropology, so I have to jump into this idea that we believe our way is better. So let's go and help others, right? Let's go and support others because our way is better, right? And so there's colonialism, another ism, right? This historical structural injustice that we have seen that plays into this idea that our way is better, right? Let's go and support, let's go and help, let's go and the helpism that Tobias Heck talks about in his work in Northeast Brazil, this concept that's called assistencialismo in Portuguese. It's this helpism. It's this desire to help that actually brings more harm, as Kelly has already pointed out in many contexts. So ethnocentrism, colonialism, paternalism, right? That we see, we can do it better. Let's do it our way, right? Which leads to opportunities for abuse in many contexts, which because of this, and Brandon, you and I studied this in class, this idea of this God complex, that syndrome that develops in those that we go to, right? Where if you become dependent on those that are giving to you, if you become dependent on those that are helping you, you begin to see them as a small g, a God. And that puts you in a very, very vulnerable situation if you begin to see others in God-like complexes, right? So it's the isms that we talk often about that really kind of have contributed or are part of the contributing factors that have led into some of these situations, but really a breakdown of systems as well and structures within organizations and so forth. So that's just the beginning of that conversation.
Well, Kelly, I would be interested for you as you lead an organization and have been living in country, and you're in the UK currently. You kind of go back and forth, but as a Westerner partnering and running an organization that has impact focus in the global South, I mean, how do you guys go about this? How do you guys establish policies and practices that work to mitigate risk and protect the children that you guys are in, the families as well that you guys are serving?
Yeah, so it's a big topic. And it's something, I think I've shared with you, Brandon, before. It's like a moving target. It's constantly evolving, constantly developing. And a starting point is, building a sound, skilled, diverse team. It's really important, both in the UK and with the implementing partner. So that is such a foundational aspect of what I'd say is so needed in this space. Teams that can hold that integrity, accountability, all those things that you need to ensure that you not just put things in place, but you maintain them. So we talk a lot about the training side, the development side. from all the way through, from, grassroots up. So you've got anyone that's working on the ground directly with the children, all the way through to your governance team. So we've been doing our best to sort of develop things continuously, and that doesn't stop. So when I spoke earlier about working as a nurse, I had to constantly develop my skills with times and with the changes that happen. And it's exactly the same in this context. So, in terms of our policies and procedures, I've seen and I've learned from a lot of different people, and I think collaboration is really important. We have definitely over the years, we've, borrowed from places, and we've also been a learning organisation for others too. And I think it's important to know that, you can't do this on your own. So if you've got an organisation, if you've got things sort of starting to, really take shape, and you're providing professional services, you need really good standards and policies and procedures within that. It doesn't matter whether you're in the global south or the global north. These things are, pivotal to make the function of your organisation and the services run well. So sometimes we've heard people that work overseas and sort of say, well, it's Kenya or it's East Africa. And that really gets my back up, and I get, quite offended, because we're working with people, working with children, vulnerable children. And so it's, imperative to ensure that we have these things in place. The value of life is just the same. We're all the same. So it's really important that we mitigate as many risks and threats as possible. So, having risk registers, risk assessments in place, extremely important. We do a lot of different research programs, we do audits, and having all these, structures in place, it's time consuming, and it's sometimes resource heavy. But when you're looking at quality over quantity, it's really important to ensure that you have all these things in place to ensure good practice and due diligence is done. So it requires attention to detail, and it requires people to be quite meticulous, particularly around the safeguarding aspect. So I think it's just, I think we can't, to have robust provisions in place, we can't just do that in the UK and not have that for our organisation in Kenya. We have to have both happen in both, and they have to complement one another, and we have to work with the local infrastructure in both of those areas to be able to mitigate as many risks as possible, follow as many, rules and guidelines as possible to be able to create great quality services for the children that we're working with.
Yep. Well, and that's all great, Kelly, because I think what it is it's always about thinking and planning for the worst and then hoping for the best. And I think, in a lot of this work, you unfortunately have to think about the worst, and how are you going to make sure that isn't going to happen, and I think when you are providing a care service as well for children, we have to remember that we are being parents, and we are a parent, and that in being a good parent, we think about how are we making sure that our child is safe. And we are risk assessing all the time as a parent. Most of the time you're doing it unconsciously, but you're doing it all the time. You're always checking, is this person safe? Is this place safe? Is this activity safe? And you're doing your own risk assessment. That doesn't stop when we have an organisation. In fact, it should increase, and it becomes more formal. But, that is what we have to do. And we have to then think about how are we making sure that anyone who's visiting is visiting safely, that they are a safe person to see. But also, I think we have to ask the question, what is the motivation for that? And what is the impact that has on the children? Because this is their lives, and they have rights, and we are being a parent, and they are expecting us to be a good parent. And we have to think about why are people visiting? What's the point? What is the purpose? What's the motivation for this? And if they are visiting, how are we making sure it's safe to do so? And I think Stephen Ukembe always made a very powerful point. People visiting, it felt like being in a zoo. Is that being a good parent? And I think part of it is asking ourselves those questions, as well as then saying, okay, what are the processes And if you're not got care, but you've still got projects, it's still the same kind of emphasis about we're taking on a responsibility for that moment in time of caring for children. How are we making sure it's safe?
Right. Well, Dan, you mentioned a couple things in there, and even that notion that Stephen had mentioned about being in a zoo. I'll never forget when I was in a bookstore in Tanzania, in Moshi, where I was living. And sometimes when we're trying to say something in Swahili, it comes a little funny because we're thinking in English. Well, the reverse happens as well. And I remember picking up this book that said it was about a group of kids, East African kids visiting what we would call a zoo. And it said, visiting the animal orphanage. And it's just kind of like, oh, wow, that's very telling. That's very on the nose. I kind of want to go off of something else that you said there, Dan, as well, in terms of planning for the worst. Okay. I'm sure that some of the cases that I shared previously, when listeners of this podcast hear it and they're involved maybe in a residential intervention, or they're doing a family-based thing, some of the things that I described there sound like the absolute worst. Like that is what we have to mitigate against, and yet it may be completely oblivious to them. I mentioned Matthew Lane Durham as one of those cases, and he was a short-term missionary, and he out of what would we say? He had the trust of the staff on ground for him to be living or sleeping in the kids' sleeping space, right? Which that should be a huge red flag to most people. And yet, because he had that level of trust, he was able to do that. And then that was the setting in which he abused children. So that sounds like the absolute worst. I remember sometimes when people would even come into the children's home that we worked at, and similar to what Kelly was saying, those interactions were just odd. They were not normal. Even the affection, the holding of children that are vulnerable kids, all of these are almost like preparatory activities, even when done in good intent, in terms of what's going to happen. I'm going to come to Greg here, and Greg, I want to hear your thoughts on this, but I would also kind of love to kind of hear from you, Greg, in terms of, I mentioned a couple of these, Dow and Durham. These were Christian missionaries, right? Or faith-based organizations. And this is what's going on. Of course, Think Orphan, we get people that listen or contribute that are not, coming from a faith background, but this is more or less a faith-based podcast. And faith-based operators, for many good reasons, are often very much represented in OBC work at a higher propensity than maybe the general population. So nonetheless, when we see people are processing, faith in Christ, going on mission, but then carrying out these abuses, how are we to react? Greg, I would love if you could speak to that, and then anything as well that in response to what Greg, Kelly, or myself said, or Dan, Kelly, or myself said. Could you just kind of speak into this, a lament, a pastoral response? How would you kind of get into this, Greg?
Yeah, at some point, naivete becomes carelessness, right? Or becomes negligence. For us as an organization, when I was working in Caracas, we reached a point where we started looking around us at different organizations, even within our own organization, as well as other global news that were coming out. This was in the early 2000s. I started hearing of stuff going on with Bruce Harris, with Casa Alianza, and other situations in Latin America. And we became aware of the need to protect our kids in ways like we never had before, right? We were also gaining attention from others in the United States wanting to come and visit, interns, volunteers. And so we really crafted a child protection policy that included protocols. It was at that point where that naivete that we had early in our years became turned into something that actually began to protect kids. I think it's at that stage where it could have easily become carelessness or negligence, but we were able to create kind of a culture of awareness within the organization that included trainings, that included implementing child protection protocols within our organization, that created a culture of suspicion. Unfortunately, it did create a culture of suspicion. Everybody in the organization, from the volunteer, from the local church pastor, to the board members, to international donors, were now having to be vetted in visitations. And I remember one situation we had, and this is where it gets really challenging for an organization. We had a situation where a very wealthy donor from the U.S. came down and visited and wanted to take kids back to his hometown in the United States to visit, and a very wealthy donor. And I absolutely, as director said, absolutely no. And, the funding dropped off, right, in that situation. But you have situations where you're confronted with these suspicious activities, and in a culture, an awareness culture within an organization will know how to respond if it is properly trained. And it is really unfortunate, Brandon and Kelly and Dan, you know this as well, that we live in a society, we live in a world where human beings, at least for my faith tradition, human beings are fallen, are sinful, and God, in the Psalms, I think of Psalm 10, God talks about wanting to protect and to defend the fatherless, right? There's a reason why he is defending the fatherless. And our job is to really protect children. God desires to defend them. He desires to use you and I. But as you mentioned, Brandon, we need to start with lamenting the injustices we see, but not stop there. If we stop with just lamenting, we're really not doing much about the situation. Lamenting has its place. I mean, we see in Psalms 13, we see David pouring out his heart about the injustices he sees in the world, and in his own life. And we should do that. We should participate in that lamenting, which is really just crying out to God about the injustices. But let's not stop there, right? We need to actually do something in exchange for that lament, and as we arrive at an opportunity of action. And that's where we put into place safeguarding policies. That's just a reality that we live in this world today. And creating a culture of awareness or of almost suspicion. I remember volunteers coming into organizations, and I was just honestly just downright suspicious of anyone wanting to come and serve with their kids. And I still treated them with dignity, the volunteers and others. I welcome them into our organization, but I was always aware as the director of that organization. And that's unfortunately the kind of cultures I think we need to create.
And at the end of the day, it's horrible to think like that, and it's not what we want to think. We want to think about the good of everyone. We want to think that this is a positive, but we have to think the worst. But and that's not just the extreme worst. And I think this is an important point. There are the extreme cases that we've talked about. There are cases that are in between that, and there are cases where if you have a mission trip where it's 16, 17, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and there's 14, 15, 16-year-old children there, that's not, it's still abusive. It's still, but it's perhaps about naivety of the people that are there, and we have to be conscious of that as well. So we've got different, pointers in that kind of risk and those safeguarding issues that we need to be able to look at and respond to. It's not a nice feeling to think the worst of situations and people.
No, it's not a nice feeling. And yet, at the same time, had people thought, and I know this is what you and Greg are both getting at, had we been more suspicious, had we been more, critical of those dynamics, perhaps some of these children would have been saved from the abuse that they ultimately suffered. Of course, when we look at these, it's kind of like we have kind of these micro level, which is that abuse taking place. We can kind of go up to the organizational level. Another level that we can kind of go to is the government level. And really there's, I had mentioned, previously when I pulled that quote from my paper, that two of the individuals that I highlighted, and just kind of in those public documented cases, they had abuse records in their countries of origin. right? So these weren't necessarily people that that wouldn't be suspicious. They would be suspicious because of their own records. We can look at some of the larger policies, including in Australia and their recent modern slavery bill, and some of the ways that ascending country like Australia is being more critical of people that are going out from Australia, and especially traveling into places like East Africa or Southeast Asia, as Australians often do on their own, volunteering or tourism trips and so forth. So there's that dynamic. There's also the dynamic of what is the government doing within the countries where these abuses are taking place. So looking at East Africa or Latin America or South and Southeast Asia. Dan, at SFAC, you guys have worked with a lot of various governments in terms of bringing about reform and child welfare and protection, in various countries throughout the world. What are some of the common recommendations that you and Mick and, the team at SFAC make so that countries can undertake, to promote child protection more broadly across a given country?
A lot of it is about developing safeguarding policies and processes and procedures. And in relation to kind of care of children, that's often about bringing in standardized, minimum standards. So, for an organization, we say, standards are about best practice. At government level, they're about the minimum standards. What are we expecting? And those minimum standards are about trying to make sure places are safe and appropriate for children. So a lot of our kind of work is more generic than this issue, and it's about that whole, how are we making sure, how do we know that the care of children in our country is safe? How do we know organizations are safe? How do we know that individuals working in those organizations are safe? What can we do as a country that enables that to happen and help organizations to achieve that? So how do we do databases? How do we make sure that organizations can access those databases? And part of that is kind of expanded now. I mean, there is a global scheme now called the Misconduct Disclosure Scheme that organizations can tap into, that's funded by various organizations, because people move from one place to another, and they move across organizations and across jurisdictions. And it's a way of how we can try and keep all that information together and organizations accessing it. So, I think for us, it's working with governments is about how the government enables organizations to make sure things are safe. Inspection systems, review systems, new registration requirements, all of those kind of processes. But also, how do you respond to situations? How do you respond to staff abusing? How do you, what are your expectations about what those processes should be? Complaint processes within organizations, which I think is one of the biggest areas that I'll probably talk a bit later on if I have the opportunity. But it's really in terms of those minimum standards about governments trying to helping organizations to say, what is it you need to be doing?
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And I think the other big piece, and you kind of see this within global development more broadly, in terms of there's really kind of two really large forces that play on these organization and family situations. And that is the government, which Dan is speaking to right now. And the other is the economy. So what we see right now is an influx of money, as I already alluded to earlier, that's kind of creating a dynamic that incentivizes, access to vulnerable children, as I had mentioned. Kelly, I kind of want to get your thoughts on this. As a CEO, you're responsible to fundraise. Greg had alluded to earlier that when he was working at an organization and a big time donor presented an unsafe and risk-inducing, just really bad idea, to put kids at risk in a very uncomfortable way. He then lost funding. As a CEO of a charity that is, raising money, and you kind of see this, I would just kind of love to hear your kind of take on the broader economy around these spaces. How do we de-incentivize the reality that by Westerners merely entering poor countries with money in hand, that they are then granted that access to vulnerable children? I would love to kind of hear your thoughts on this, Kelly.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this area. It's been something that over the last few years I've really sort of had to grapple with, because, we have standards that we will not compromise. So for us as an organization, we've had to really come to terms with where our line is, ethically, economically, whatever line, you want to call it. We know that there's a real need, especially, the last few years, for more funds, because funds are dropping quite rapidly, particularly over here in the UK. I'm not sure what it's like over there in the US, but for us, we are really struggling in various different ways. Less grants that we can apply for, particularly cross culturally. So we have actually had to decline many different sort of routes of finance, specifically because we do not agree with what that means. I would say, as Christians as well, we're motivated by our values. Most people in the world are motivated by their values, whether they're Christian or not. But it comes down to how you're going to compromise your values, because, we are not going to exploit children. We're not going to allow the economical crisis, globally, to affect the way that we fundraise. And so, there's a line, and you have to learn to say no, and you have to learn to find other ways, other means. So that's something as an organization we're having to really come to terms with. We've transitioned the way that we do fundraising various times over the last few years. We've changed our sponsorship campaign, for example. No longer do we really even agree with child sponsorship the way that it happens globally. And so we're having to really look at these topics, and as an organization, but also journey that with our donors and our supporters. So I think it's a big topic. It's something that I think in the UK, I see, particularly in churches, there needs to be more engagement. Christians have really fed into things like the orphanage crisis. And so it's also a big responsibility of ours. Safeguarding is a responsibility of everybody. And so it's our responsibility as leaders of organizations, as Christians, to actually work out, collaborate. And I think that there's something about marrying sort of mission with management. We can't just be faith driven. We need, if someone gives you a vision for something, and, for the leaders of the organizations that I've always worked with, it's always been vision that they see, they believe has been from God, right? So if God has given you a vision, he'll give you the strategy. And it's the same with the finance aspect. If there is a vision that's been given to you, you have to trust God for the finances for that. And you can't be compromised on that either. So we are, very outspoken in some ways, around this topic, because it has meant we've dropped our finances several times over the last few years, because we have, again, just not compromised on how we do things as an organization. There's been times I've had to challenge, my own board, and make sure that we're all in alignment with how we do things. And I think keeping that conversation going is really important.
No, that's really good, Kelly. And you mentioned something there as we talk about the fundraising and the budget, kind of mechanisms that are in place. Child sponsorship, which you said you guys have had to rethink, redevelop how you generate those funds. You guys have done that, and we had this conversation multiple times. I think to our conversation with Brent Phillips on this, our conversation with Morgan Weinberg on this, more recently with Dr. Hunter Farrell. So this has come up from time to time. I would be interested to kind of hear, from Greg and Dan as well, this child sponsorship thing. When we talk about supporting vulnerable kids in the global South, this is like the ubiquitous, fundraising model. Greg, maybe you could just kind of speak to that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I'm not really prepared to give a full-blown critique to child sponsorship programs. It's a large conversation taking place right now within best practice conversations, and that we could probably say for another day. But certainly, I do want to raise awareness of the fact that the programs that we used to run in child sponsorship would invite sponsors into proximity with the children that they were sponsoring. It would invite sponsors into the homes, into space with these children, and there's just so many problems that could potentially come about in those contexts and that space. And so I hope I'm not stepping on too many feet when I say that we just need to be incredibly careful with sponsorship visits. There are a number of small organizations where naivete has ended up turning into carelessness and negligence. And for those contexts, we need to do a much better job in ensuring that child protection is in place for those child sponsorship visits as well. That much we know, right?
And I think I would add to that as a person who's done child protection for many years, and including doing sexual abuse assessments, child sponsorship worries me in terms of risk, because it's an opportunity for grooming, and it requires really significant protective mitigations in place to manage that safely. So yes, there's a great attraction in terms of it bringing money in, absolutely, but there is also a real open door for abuse and exploitation, and I think it's a really difficult subject. From a child protection perspective, it's always something that makes me worried. From a power relationship, it makes me worried. From power dynamics, it makes me worried. So, I will always look at it from those lenses. And I think it's something that we have to be, as Greg says, and Kelly's kind of said, I think it's something we have to be very careful about and very mindful of.
Yeah, no, in a lot of ways, as we were kind of talking about, hey, there's this broader piece of short-term missionaries, volunteerists, or so forth that are coming into these spaces. They don't have bad intent. They're not abusing children. It's within that environment, though, that the abuse cases do come out. And in the same way, when we talk about child sponsorship, we can look, again, this is also a multi-billion-dollar, type of thing. World Vision USA is a $1.5 billion organization. Compassion International is over $1 billion. And of course, those organizations might critique one another. And we might look at that and be like, well, this is how it might be done safely. But it creates an environment where all these other small nonprofits that are more operating, 5 and 6 figure budgets are also using that as a mechanism, and yet they may not have the same level of critique that something like a World Vision does, right? And again, this isn't speaking to some of the ethical things or some of the things that we talked about with Dr. Farrell recently, but nonetheless, we have to kind of look at what is the environment that we are setting in terms of not only child protection, but even the fundraising mechanisms. And I think that that's why we have to be critical of aspects of child sponsorship, which again is ubiquitous within orphan care ministries. Okay. So one thing I do also kind of want to just mention, and I had alluded to this earlier, I'm going to come to Dan one more time. We want to acknowledge that foreigners abusing children, this is not the majority of abuse and exploitation that could take place. It does happen. As I had mentioned, it is likely underreported, which just means that it's the same as abuse across the board. Abuse is almost always underreported, right? We don't know the full extent of abuse, exploitation, neglect, these really harmful adversities that children go through, right? We don't know the full extent of those. So it is underreported, but it's also probably a minority. Peer-to-peer abuse is typically regarded as the most common. Staff to child is also a reality. I don't want to only focus on these kind of cross-cultural pieces that might be in the minority. Dan, as a qualified social worker that's operated in a lot of these spaces, what are some of the more important policies that organizations should employ to protect children from abuse and exploitation in general, even aside from kind of foreigners coming into their ministries?
How long you got?
I got about 10 minutes.
I mean, I could talk for hours about it. In general, I think you've got to start from how are we going to be a good parent, and therefore, if you are caring for children, then I'll start kind of in that For us, it's about having proper care planning processes in place so you know that you're meeting the needs of the child and being able to evidence that, but also that you know your children. It's about training programs, it's about safeguarding processes, it's about your standards, it's about being open to reviewing your practice and reviewing your practice both internally but also externally. And that might be done by governments, but you might also say, actually, I want something else. One of our chair of trustees previously is retired now, but he used to run a social services and child protection and child care department in the UK. Huge organisation, one of the local authorities here. And he would say, one of the things I want is independent reviews coming in. Even though I've got the government reviewing, even though I've got my managers reviewing, even though I've got children, I speak to children on a regular basis, I still want that external review because I want to answer the question, how do I know? How do I know and how can I evidence? And I think that to me is always the most crucial question. And it's not just a crucial question for you as a provider. If you're a donor, ask the question, how do I know that organization is safe? How do I know they're doing good practice? How are they looking after children? How are you protecting children? How are you doing good assessments? How do I know a reunification is safe? What's your quality of assessment? And if you say, reunification is really simple and easy, well, they're probably not doing it right because it's complex, it's difficult, it's hard work, it takes time, there will be failures. Yeah. How, if you say you're doing a foster care, how are you doing it? What's your processes? What's your assessment systems? I have always a saying that, if you do good social work, it's a simple idea, but you have to make it complicated. And, it's finding that out, and it's finding out how organizations do it. And then for organizations, it's about saying, how are we making sure that we are doing the right thing for children? How are we making sure that our practice is good and is safe? And there's a whole load of processes in that, really. We do a lot of work with organizations to kind of go through the systems, and each organization in each country will be different. There's no one answer to it, but there are core principles and core processes that you can adapt to your situation. And I think one of the things that I alluded to a little bit earlier that I kind of really want to emphasize the importance of is a complaint process in an organization, especially a complaint process for children, but also a complaint process for people that know children. Because the child can't always make the complaint themselves. And I think one of the most critical things about here is a giving opportunity for children to say, there is something going wrong. There is something happening to me, and I need someone to know about it. Creating those support networks, creating that place where a child can feel safe to take that risk on purpose for a reason, I think is one of the most imperative things that we should be doing. And one of the things I think for organizations is how are you enabling children to raise an issue? How are you giving children a voice into that?
Yeah, I think those are really those are really important things to consider, Dan. And, those are kind of the principles that we should be working off of. And what I would love for our listeners to also walk away with is not just, okay, we looked at some of these specific cases, we talked about some of these principles and, what people should be looking at. But also, I want them to walk away with some tools and some resources. Now, aside from Kelly, who's just genius, and anybody can reach out to Kelly and pick her brain. I know she loves to connect with people. We also have two people representing equipping type of organizations. So there are resources that pertain to child protection, towards minimum standards, and I would love to, and these are even available digitally. So Greg, I'm going to come to you first. Maybe you could just kind of speak to some of the resources that Multnomah has that listeners of ours could be potentially tapping into. Well, first of all, Multnomah is a great graduate program, so that's just right off the bat if you guys want. But that I personally attest to. But even beyond that, Greg, what are some resources out there, either from Multnomah or that you have seen that people could be equipping themselves with?
Brandon, I need to give you more opportunities to teach here at Multnomah on child protection. You and I do co-teach a course together, and you probably hear sirens in the background that's going on, but you and I do teach a course on children at risk, and part of that course, I've developed a small online course called Protecting the Vulnerable, Keeping Kids Safe Globally. You can find that at Multnomah Plus, Multnomah, MULTNOMAH Plus. Just Google Multnomah Plus, Greg Burch, and you'll probably come up with that course. But, there's a lot of good organizations that have produced some wonderful material. I love Child Hope UK, some of the material they have produced over the years on child protection. I've used it in our work. I've used it in the classroom. Consortium for Street Children also has a number of resources specifically on protecting street living children. I would encourage you to look at, if that's the more context, if that's the more specific group of people you work with, look at what the consortium has for child protection. Again, Child Hope is great material, and Consortium for Street Children, as well as the short online program that I teach here at Multnomah.
That's really good, Greg. And I would just encourage people, the show notes on this particular episode are going to be pretty robust in a way. So I would encourage you guys, we'll have the Multnomah Plus course available. It's it's only like $10, I think, right? So I even have it as supplemental child protection training for staff at 1 Million Home. I mean, it's a really good program, and we'll have other resources linked as well. Dan, I believe you guys work with not just child welfare programs in general, but even children's homes specifically. Maybe you can highlight some of the resources that you guys have. And before you do that, I'll even just kind of highlight, last time we had you, Mick, and Caitlin on, we were talking about the Journey Home course on family reunification and safeguarding, which our listeners can tap into at journeyhome.com. 1millionhome.com/journeyhome. That's where we want to send you. That will be linked as well. But Dan, other resources that you guys have available, I would love to hear.
Well, we're in the process of creating a whole load at the moment. We're just renewing a whole load. So very soon will be resources about how to do reviews, and a tool that will kind of assist you as an organization develop your own review tool. We will have some tools coming out about how to create safeguarding policies and processes and procedures in your organization. But what we, and there will be a whole range of other material that's coming out soon over the next kind of 12 months that we've been developing for a while. But what we tend to do a lot is work with organizations on a one-to-one level to really make that resource, help you build that resource, and for that resource to work for your context. Because every organization is different, and every organization's context is different. So we do a lot of that kind of one-to-one stuff, and you can always contact us through the website at SFAC, so it's sfac.org.uk, or you can just email us at info@sfac.org.uk, and we get back to you, and we talk to organisations there. Kelly will testify. We've done some work with Kelly, so there are lots of resources coming up. Lots of resources that will come out that will be available on the website, but there's also a lot of stuff that we work with you to develop.
Yeah,
and I would
really recommend.
Go ahead, Kelly. Give your recommendation.
So I'd highly recommend SFAC do fantastic work working with organisations like ours, small organisation, but to really help put, better standards in. So I've really learned a lot from Dan myself as well over the years.
Absolutely. Well, we only have the best of the best on Think Orphan, and Dan, Mick, and Caitlin are certainly that. So I would love to just again remind our listeners that all of these resources, Multinoma Plus, other resources from externals, SFAC will have that linked, so you guys can just land directly on their website. The Journey Home course that we did with SFAC, all of those things are just a click away if you go into your show notes, whether you're listening in Apple or Spotify or where have you. All right, we got one final rapid fire question. So in under 60 seconds, I'm going to come to Ms. Strong first. If someone is listening and they have child protection concerns within their organization, what is the most important thing that they should do to address it?
It's a great question. Don't ignore it. If you're watching this and you think that what we've said is inflammatory or filled with, everything we've said is so vital. It's not an issue. Safeguarding, the lack of safeguarding, it's not an issue. It's not a crisis. It's a reality. And it's affecting little children in our world every day. There's systematic violations and exploitation of children happening right now. And unless we all together work to protect children better and make changes, it will continue. And it starts with small scale things and it ends with systematic change. And so we have to make it a priority. Even if you have to downsize, spend less money, doing other services or developing your services, but you focus on safeguarding, it's so much better to produce quality instead of quantity. So make it your business, do everything you can to make it your business, get the conversation going. Every time you have board meetings, staff meetings, safeguarding.
All right, Greg, same question.
Kelly really, covered the issue in many ways. I would just agree, Kelly, just say something, right? Just say something to anyone, even if it's at great, perhaps personal risk. Say something. Children are worth it. Children are deemed by God to be the most important in His kingdom. We see that throughout Scripture. They are critical to the kingdom of God. They are critical to us, to our society. Say something, and also create a culture of awareness. And that happens by doing exactly what Kelly said, just talking about it in the board meetings, with your volunteers, with your donors. It should become a predominant value within your organization.
Really good. Dan, same question.
Hopefully you'd have a policy and process in place that you can follow, and it doesn't sit on a shelf and you just look at it. You actually pick it up and it tells you what to do. If you haven't got that, then reach out. Hopefully you can make referrals to the government or to the police if that's safe and appropriate to do so. And if you haven't got it as an organization, then I would say reach out to get support to put those policies, procedures in place. This isn't a tick box exercise. This, as both Greg and Kelly have just said, this should be at the heart. Yeah. At the end of the day, your primary job as a parent is to protect your children. The primary role of any organization and any individual working with children, especially vulnerable children, is to protect them. That should be at the heart of everything we do, and everything else works around that.
Well, I could not have ended it on a better sentiment than that, Dan. And thank you to all three of you, Greg, Kelly, Dan. I really appreciate your guys' insight and expertise as we have covered this material. Last plug, check out the show notes for all the resources so that you guys can be better equipped as we all seek the best for children and also mitigate those people that maybe don't have the best interests of these kids at heart. It is an incumbent on all of us that are engaging with children to protect them throughout our time working with them. So again, Greg, Kelly, Dan, thank you guys all for joining us on the Think Orphan podcast. I would encourage you guys not only to check out the show notes, but reach out to us at hello@1millionhome.com if you guys have additional questions or would appreciate, any one-on-one follow-up as well. We want to make sure that organizations are equipped to serve children. So As always, we hope that you take everything that you hear here on Think Orphan, that you use it so that you can love and serve orphan and vulnerable children as well as their families better and better each and every day. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you again in a couple weeks.
We hope you've enjoyed today's Think Orphan podcast. For all the information in this week's podcast, please visit us at thinkorphan.com. You too can be part of the conversation. Send your questions to info@thinkorphan.com or join us on the Think Orphan Facebook page. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again on the next edition of Think Orphan.